Hello reptile fans, the world is changing. Is it time for live reptile shows to change as well? The world is changing. You're finding out it's easier to buy online. It's easier to go on a site and buy a coffee mug in your bunny slippers. Is it time for the reptile community to change as well? For reptile buyers and sellers, we've had fauna classified and king snake, and now with the recent events, we have morph market. This past weekend, June 6th, I attended my first virtual reptile show. The show was sponsored by Reptile Streams, and I'll throw a link in the description below to Tom Kelly and Reptile Streams. I'll be sharing with you my expectations for the show before the show, my experience with the show while it was going on, and in conclusion, I'll summarize my evaluation of this show and how it relates to what we're doing in the reptile community. Here's a question for you. How do you buy your reptiles? Do you buy them at reptile shows? Do you buy them online? Do you buy most of your animals at pet stores or some other method? Leave a comment below and let me know how you buy your reptiles. As a reptile keeper, I grew up with reptile shows. Over the last 20 years, I've vended well over 100 reptile shows, maybe closer to 200. Far before my first show of vending, I attended many reptile shows just to get a feel for what it would be like to vend a reptile show. I prepared my animals, I got everything in order. I overanalyze everything. I attended my first show, set everything up, and before the show even started, I had another vendor stop by, look at my animals, and say, "Wally, they're all marked wrong." I was selling leopard geckos and I had marked them all male because I saw a little bit of a bulge in the leopard gecko. The breeder informed me that that was pretty common with leopard geckos, especially when they were well fed, for females to show like they were males. He was nice enough to go through all of my deli cups and help me mark them from male to female. That was an experience I'll never forget. So why am I telling this story? Well, I think live reptile shows will always have a place in the hobby. But I think this virtual show that happened this last weekend has its place too, and we'll talk about it next. So before this show, I had 3 expectations for this virtual show. First, technology. How is this going to work? Are the connections going to stay up for the vendors, for myself? I really had a serious question about this. Also, how would I talk to the breeders? Could I get in there and ask them specific questions? My second big question would be, would there be enough variety? Would there be snakes and big supply vendors? Would there be arachnid vendors? Would there be frogs and inverts? Would there be jewelry, crafts, chickens? And obviously the big question for me would be, would there be gecko vendors? And third, how would these animals be shown? Would the vendor hold up individual animals? So I would have to wait for several animals to actually see the first animal that I was really interested in. I wasn't sure how that concept would work on a virtual reptile show. Before I get into actually showing the virtual show, I wanted to point out some differences, some anticipated differences between a virtual show and a live reptile show. Let's start with the benefits. For everybody, there's a huge benefit in time savings. I've driven to reptile shows, 4 hours there, 4 hours back. It's a whole day to view a few animals. I've also attended reptile shows in the middle of winter when it was 10 degrees outside and a foot of snow on the ground. I've attended reptile shows where it's 100 degrees out. So there's a concern for my health and well-being, and obviously for the reptiles. In a virtual show, you don't have that whatsoever. Virtual shows are informal. Again, I could go in my bunny slippers and PJs and nobody will know. Virtual shows aren't the big reptile shows. Those big reptile shows take so much time and prep for, something like an NARBC. They can only be held once or twice a year. These virtual shows, with the right preparation, can be held throughout the year. Are you a reptile keeper that's rural? Do you live out in the country? Do you not have reptile shows near you? Again, I've driven 4 hours to reptile shows. I'm lucky enough to have 6 or 7 reptile shows within a couple of hours of me. here in Wisconsin, so it really works out for me. Perhaps you're in an area where you just don't have reptile shows near you. Virtual shows are as close as click, 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 and you're there. And of course, the big topic of the day, social distancing. Right now, with everything opening up, that's a major, major concern for the vendors and for the attendees. How is this going to happen with social distancing? How about some benefits for you and me as buyers at a show? I know I visited breeder tables where the animals are just scattered all over the place, and it took a half hour to find the one animal that I was really interested in. There's certainly a possibility with live shows that you could go right to the animal that you're looking for. Hey, with virtual shows, there's no buyer pressure. You don't have a buyer trying to sell you an animal. If you have that with a virtual show, it's as easy as click and you can go to another vendor's table. With a virtual show, you can take your time, sign on, go from one vendor to the next vendor to the next vendor. It's as easy as click, click, click. And how about parking? I hate going to a show and parking 4 blocks away. Well, how about for vendors? What's the benefit for vendors? Well, that's really easy. There's certainly a lot less stress on the animals on a virtual show than there is packing them up and taking them to a live show. And while as a vendor I've not found this to be a problem, there's certainly always a concern about theft at a show. You're not going to have that in a virtual show. And for vendors, it's certainly a lot easier in that you can take photos of your animals, show them on the page, and you don't have to rifle through a lot of animals in deli cups. That's just a pain in the butt. And for organizers of virtual shows, well, number one, there's really no limit on the number of vendors or tables that you can have at these shows. And how about the logistics of setting up a show? Contacting vendors, setting up vendors, finding a venue, finding concessions, setting up electricity, hoping the electricity stays on. There's just so many logistical concerns that a show organizer has. Let me talk about the big obstacles that I think are related to virtual reptile shows. Number one is technology. How accepting will everybody be when the technology fails? Once you lose connection, how accepting will somebody be waiting a minute or two for the connection to reappear and be able to talk to a vendor or look at other animals? With a virtual show, there's no touchy-feely. And that holds true with both buyers and sellers. For buyers, a lot of people want to pick up that animal and hold it and feel it and check it out. For a seller, there's no easier way for me to sell an animal, especially a crested gecko, than to hand that animal over to somebody that's potentially looking for a reptile as their first pet. Crested geckos virtually sell themselves when I do that. Another obstacle is that there's no real face-to-face communication. Now, some might find that that's a benefit. I personally find that that's a negative. I like to talk. I like that exchange between the buyer and the seller and maybe some negotiation. I'm sure that there's going to be negotiation on a virtual show, but it's just a little bit more difficult. Another obstacle is shipping costs. We have to look at that. There's absolutely going to be weather considerations, both too hot and too cold to ship. It's just going to cost money to ship. And if you buy from different vendors, you're going to have multiple shipping costs. No way around that. As these virtual shows grow, there's going to be more vendors, there's going to be more attendees. Try to imagine a big-time breeder being in one of these virtual shows, showing off their animals, hundreds of animals, and having a communication with 1,000 attendees asking virtually the same question. That's going to be tough. How are these virtual shows going to work with full-time, big-time hard good vendors? I don't understand how logistically that's going to happen. It's going to be hard for the customer to pick and choose the items that they're looking for, to maybe set up their first enclosure and ask the right questions of the seller. That's going to be tough too. And of course, another obstacle is there's just not going to be any cash transactions. I'm not going to be able to hand $5 over to somebody to pick up a culture of fruit flies. Hey, did I miss any benefits or obstacles to these virtual reptile shows? If I did, leave a comment below and let me know. So let's get into the show itself. I had great communication with Tom Kelly, the organizer, the owner of Reptile Stream, before the show. Just absolutely fantastic communication. He talked about the show, what his expectations were. I had a number of questions for him. He answered all the questions. great communication. Really appreciate it, Tom, if you get a chance to watch this. I really didn't see a lot of communications on Instagram or YouTube, and not a whole lot on Facebook, but I was really pleased with the email communications from Tom. The day before the show, I received an email. The day of the show, I received an email. Links were perfect. I jumped on probably about a half hour before the show. There was a great timer going off. Everything worked perfect. Great communication. I waited, 10, 9, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Then nothing happened. And I sat at the screen. A minute went by, 2 minutes, refresh, F5, come on, let's go. I want to get into the show. Nothing happened. After about 7 or 8 minutes, I thought, is it me? Am I doing something wrong? Should I just close out my browser, open it up again? Well, I did that, went back to the link, opened the link, and we were live. So I think the problem was that as I sat on that initial screen, that screen ended, but the live show began, and I should have just backed all the way out and gone back in. So that was on me. So now I'm in this virtual show. What do I do first? Well, I took a look around, and the site was better than I anticipated. It was great, showing the the lobby, showing all of the vendors. It had a featured vendor. It had a frequently asked questions. The site was just exactly what I was anticipating, and then more. In the lobby, you could select the vendors that you wanted to visit. I went into a couple just to get a feel for what was going on. Once I went into one of the vendors, there was a live chat going on. There was a live vendor presentation, or showing the vendors a table, their animals, or them showing off animals. If you paged down on that site, then you saw all of that vendor's animals. It was perfect. The pictures were absolutely great. There was a section for vendor information. The chat was live. There were some concerns about a lag. I didn't see that much of a lag. I thought the site presentation was just perfect in the vendor pages. So I bounced out of a couple of vendors and then tried to visit every single one. And of I think there were 16 or 17 vendors, there were 2 that weren't online. And there was a third that was having technical difficulties. They were online. Their chat was working. Their animals down below, their gallery was working, but they weren't live. And that was a little bit of a problem. So as long as the vendors and as long as the customers, the attendees, are a little bit patient with the first initial stages of the show, that's not an issue. But some customers might not be patient enough and might bounce out of there. So that might be a concern for the show organizer. As for myself, I had no technical issues at all. It was just perfect. Now, if I had a problem with the communications and I dropped for a minute or two, that wouldn't have been a problem. If I would have had a problem with my communications and I would have dropped for more than a couple of minutes, that would have been a problem for me. I would have been frustrated. I might not continue to attend the show. But isn't that just like going to a live reptile show? If I have car problems, I'm going to be frustrated too. At this point, I want to say that there were some vendors that just did a phenomenal job, both showing off their animals live, having a perfect page, a presentation of their animals available for sale, and then talking to the customers, talking to the viewers, and doing the live chat. I visited a couple of vendors and chatted for a little bit and had almost an immediate response. It was perfect. Now, looking at this virtual show, there were only, in any room that I was in any chat room that I was in, I probably only saw 6 to 8 people in each chat. So as the show grows, that's going to be more of a concern that can only be accommodated by the vendors actually staffing up for a show like this. So what was my takeaway from the show? Well, I certainly thought that it exceeded my expectations. And I had some pretty big expectations of this. I thought the individual communications on the show was absolutely perfect. The emails, all the communications to me, the survey that was presented after the show, the email after the show asking me my opinion. Even though I wasn't a breeder and showing at the show, I still got that email asking for my opinion. I thought that was just perfect. I appreciate that. And the website, I don't know if I have any other suggestions for that website. It was perfect. You had the featured vendor that was just right on. Going into the vendor page, finding a vendor was certainly easy. Going into a vendor's page and seeing their animals, talking to a vendor, asking them, can I see this animal? All the vendors that I talked to, and if I asked to see an animal, they went right away to the animal and pulled it out and showed me. Connectivity wise, I mean, I was fine, so I was happy. Again, there were a couple of vendors that it didn't work out for. I know one vendor certainly couldn't connect at all. Another vendor couldn't connect their live presentation. Their live chat was going. You could see their animals, which worked out, you know, if you were looking for a specific animal. But their live presentation showing off their animals, that didn't actually connect, at least for the show that I attended, the part of the show that I attended. So those are the positives. How about some negatives? Well, I thought that there was very little noise on this show in Instagram or Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, on any of the social media sites. I didn't really see a whole lot. I guess my suggestion would be come up with a hashtag. There's got to be more promotion, I guess, publicity for this show in the future to get people drawn into the show, especially the vendors. Speaking of vendors, there really was a limited number of vendors. Again, I think the count was 17. I might be wrong with that. But I was certainly hoping for more vendors, 30 to 40. And I know this is a first go at this, and there's going to be more vendors and there's going to be more attendees. And I know, you know, from the communications that I've seen from Tom, he's going to do a great job in getting this ball rolling. But for this first show, there just was a limited number of vendors. And from a variety of animals available, and this is just like any other reptile show, everything seemed to be snakes. Now, if you're a snake person, that's just great. You love it. As a gecko person, an invert person, I was hoping for at least a couple, 3, 4 sites with geckos. Maybe even a site with more rare geckos. I just didn't see that. A little bit disappointed there, but understandable. There was one site, I believe, with leopard geckos, and those leopard geckos are just absolutely unbelievable. I could have mentioned this in the positives, but I'm going to leave it in the negatives. As a positive, there was a coordinator from the show going around each room. I was in probably 4 or 5 rooms where this happened, with them asking the vendors, the breeders, to talk to their community, the people viewing the site at that time. And I thought that was fantastic, trying to engage everybody, all the vendors, to communicate. Unfortunately, as a negative, there were a few that it was hard. But again, you're going to find that at normal reptile shows. You're going to find some vendors, some breeders, sitting down at the table with a book or their phone and checking messages and not engaged as much with the customers. And that's a shame, and we certainly saw that in this show. But all in all, the positives far, far outweighed the negatives in my mind. At least that's what I felt. So here's the big question. Would I, as a breeder or a vendor or an attendee, a paying customer, would I attend another or be a vendor at another Reptile Stream event? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this will be a growing event, and I think it has a lot of potential. In fact, you might see me at the very next Reptile Stream event. That's if, after watching this video, I'm still allowed to be at that event. And finally, the real question. After watching this video, would you attend a virtual reptile show? Thanks for watching.